an evolutionary anthropologist, and I sometimes describe myself as a cultural evolutionist, which I guess in practice means I'm some sort of blend of a biologist, a psychologist, and an anthropologist. And what I'm not really much of at all is a neuroscientist or a computer scientist, or really, much of what makes up the audience here. So it's been a real pleasure actually to be here for the past few days. So thank you for inviting me. It's real valuable for me to get to hear about research that I don't normally have so much of access to. And I guess hopefully I will try and repay the favor a bit by presenting some work from, that maybe you guys don't get that much access to routinely either. So what I'm going to do is present 3 evolutionary models about the evolution of cognition or intelligence, all of which are currently underway with myself and some collaborators. And they've all kind of curiously come together towards the same conclusion, which we weren't originally setting out to investigate, which, at least from a biological point of view, is, I think, quite surprising. So if you were a biology undergraduate or one of my anthropology undergraduates, you might be exposed to a slide like this. So when we talk about the evolution of cognition, it's often in the context of something called life history theory, where there's this kind of broad spectrum across, in particular, mammalian species of what's called fast and slow life histories. So in the fast species, typified by the mouse, they're small, they grow quickly, they have short gestation lengths, they have large litters, they have small brains, even relative to their body size, and they don't live very long. So, this is a kind of quantity over quality strategy. And at the other end here, signified by the elephant, but really, we're probably really thinking about us when we talk about this. We have species that have bigger bodies, they grow slowly, they have long gestation and also long childhoods, small litters, often just one child at a time, large brains for their body size, and they live a long time. Okay. And as some evidence of this, so finally, I'm going to be talking a lot about this connection then between brain size and lifespan. So here's some evidence of this. This is a paper from a few years ago by Sally Street et al. And it's looking across the primates for co-evolutionary patterns across some of these factors. So here's a primate phylogeny on the left-hand side. And then these different colors, red is the ability to learn from other individuals in your group. The gray is brain volume, green is group size, and purple is lifespan or longevity. And what you can see is there's clear correlations between these across species. So this pattern holds really well across primates and across mammals more generally. And I would argue that this has given rise to what I might characterize as sort of a monotonic view of cognition. There's this idea that cognition is part of a package of traits, including lifespan and body size and all that sort of stuff, and they're tightly connected to each other, such that they basically just slide up and down this unidimensional scale. And it's not necessarily the case either, but I think it's also given rise to this idea that this package of traits, they're co-evolving with each other, but they're also responding in a monotonic fashion to some sort of external condition, right? Something like environmental complexity or just something, whatever it is that you need cognition to solve, the more of that there is, you get more of this package, right? And so things like elephants, dolphins, and humans are at one extreme, and I don't know, some less intelligent creatures are at the other end. But if we broaden the scope at which we're looking at this, actually, this package starts to disintegrate. So this is some data from a couple of years ago in the Journal of Fish Biology, Stark et al. 2022. And they looked for these relationships in the fishes. And so on the left, we have the bony fishes. On the right, the cartilaginous fishes. And this is the relative brain mass, so brain mass relative to body size on the x-axis. And the y-axis is lifespan. And what you can see is in the bony fishes, there is basically no relationship at all. And in the cartilaginous fishes, so the sharks, there is a very slight negative relationship. So the sharks that live longer tend to have smaller brains for their body size than the sharks that don't live quite as long. So in this case, it looks like lifespan or longevity has somehow managed to fall out of this package, or maybe brain size is the thing that's fallen out of this package, right? So this complex of traits that seems so robust in mammals, at least in other families, is disintegrating. And in birds, the pattern is not at all clear either. So what's going on? So this is my postdoc, Robin Watson. Like all good postdocs, he's not going to be my postdoc for much longer. In a few weeks, he'll be starting as a faculty member at the University of Lincoln. But so we set out to use formal theory to try and explore this and figure out what was going on. So we constructed a simulated world for this, to study this evolutionary process. And in this world, agents, all they have to do is solve two kinds of tasks. And the better they can solve them, by increasing their ability at them, the better their fitness, the more offspring they have when it comes time to reproduce. And so across repeats of this, we fixed two factors. One is lifespan, and the other is environmental complexity. So lifespan is just how many goes, basically, you get at these tasks before you reproduce and die. So it's kind of related to how much data you can possibly collect. And then the other thing we varied was environmental complexity. So this is a very simple environment, so there's only so complex that it can possibly get. So what we did is we varied the relative frequency of the two tasks that they have to solve. In a very simple environment, let's call them task A and task B, it's basically all task A. So it reduces down to an environment with a single task. In a very complex environment, the two tasks occur at equal frequencies, and so you basically need to try and solve both of them. And in this world, in varied conditions, we let cognition evolve. And cognition had 4 aspects which could evolve independently. The first one, specialization, is a sort of anti-cognition. It's just a genetic propensity to be able to do something kind of innately, we might say. But the cost that it comes with is if you specialize genetically to be good at task A, it reduces your ability to solve task B. Then the next 3, map onto something that we might think of as more cognitive. The second one is the ability to learn from experience. So when you interact with a task, how much does that increase your probability of solving it the next time you interact with it? The third one is generalization. So this is if you interact with task A, how does that affect your ability to then go on and solve task B? So a good generalizer can see the commonalities between these tasks and transfer information freely between them. Someone incapable of that has to interact with each task directly. And the fourth one was vertical transmission, so the ability to learn from your parents. So if your parent had learned a lot and was successful, you can acquire some of that during your childhood. So these 2, 3, and 4 all come with some sort of metabolic cost associated with having to, the neural machinery to let you do them. Specialization doesn't have a metabolic cost, but it's a trade-off between specializing in one and getting worse at the other. So we let these evolve. In the figures I'm going to show you, we actually just turn vertical transmission off just to simplify the results, but it doesn't really change the results. So you'll get the right idea. Okay, so if we start just by looking at creatures with short lifespans, which we call ephemeral or short, what we see is, so the flat green line at the bottom is vertical transmission, which we've turned off. Then learning speed and generalization just evolve to be as close to the bottom as they can. They're basically, mutation, selection, balance. They're trying to be turned off. And the only thing that evolves is specialization. And this is true even when the environment is maximally complex. So it makes sense that in a world where one of the tasks is more frequent, just specialize in that one. But even when they're both frequent, it turns out the strategy that evolution picks up in this case is it basically just randomly specializes in one of them. It's you pick one at random, you specialize in it, and just accept that half the time you're facing a task that you don't know how to solve. Okay, but sort of in keeping with this idea from life history theory, as these creatures live longer, we start seeing the switch to a cognitive regime, basically. So at an environmental complexity, so this is 0 complexity means it's all task A. Maximum complexity means it's equal amounts task A and B. When you get to about halfway between the two, specialization starts to drop, and we see these big spikes in learning speed and generalization. And in the extreme, specialization is basically gone. So there's no biases built into these species. They're just trying to solve these tasks using cognition. And at the longest lifespans, this trend is continued, right? So there's now only a very small space where it actually pays to specialize. It's only in the most simplistic environments possible. And in most of the space, you're using cognition to solve it. There's still this kind of transitional period where you're a little bit specialized. And then you go into this not at all specialized, fully cognitive thing.
Question? Yeah. The relative costs of doing well in any one of these 4 dimensions are set once and for all by you. And
yes.
And so if you change those parameters, we might see different curves, correct?
Yeah, so they are held constant within each run, which is something that I'll talk about in a little bit. But it's true that, yeah, so we have to pick a value for them, right? And if you change the value, it doesn't really change the qualitative results. So for instance, if you make brains cheaper, then these same dynamics happen, but they just happen at shorter lifespans. And if you make them more expensive, you just push all this stuff off indefinitely. If you change the relative costs of these different cognitive abilities, then you see, that causes differential investment in them. Yeah, does that make sense?
Thank you.
So at first glance, this seems to support the kind of the life history model where, lifespan and cognition are co-evolving. But there's 2 things I want to flag. The first, there we go, is this, which is that actually the greatest investment in cognition occurs at medium lifespans. And although there's a wide range of environmental complexities under long lifespans where cognition evolves, the actual investment in cognition is lower. So if we were to look at these, we might say that if we met these creatures in the wild or something, they're both performing these tasks really well, but these guys are in a hurry, right? They are quickly reaching a highly effective level of performance. And we might think of them, therefore, as cognitively very sophisticated. They're really getting the most out of the data available to them. And these creatures are taking a more kind of luxurious approach, right? They don't need to learn as fast because they have longer to live. So they're kind of inefficient with things. But it's worth it because if they have to, put so much energy into growing a big complex brain, sure, they could learn faster, but then they've got that brain for the rest of their lives. They're going to live a long time. They keep having to put more and more energy into that brain, and it's just not worth it.
So as I move my eyes from medium to long, I can see the curves, all the 3 curves becoming lower on the right-hand side, which would mean that the costs are overall lower on the right-hand side. And so I don't see the trade-off that must be there in giving you this result.
But you don't see why this is happening?
So I see all 3 curves. No, exactly. So I don't see... So sorry. So maybe you said it and I missed it. Okay.
So I guess the idea is that the cost of cognition, you can think of it in terms of, how many calories you need to eat a day to keep your brain going. By living a longer time, these creatures are alive for many more days. So that cost adds up across their lifetime, basically. And if they invested as much in their cognition as these shorter-lived creatures, then they would approach ceiling performance very quickly, but then they're still maintaining that mental machinery for the rest of their lives, and they're still having to pay to keep it there, basically. And so in this case, it takes them longer in absolute time to reach ceiling performance, but they still get there quite early in their lifespan because they live a long time.
So I have a question which is about the probability distribution of different tasks. Because there could be assumption that it's sort of friendly or Gaussian, or it could be that you occasionally get really challenging tasks. So there, basically, if you're not smart enough, you die, right? So,
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the distribution, assumptions on the distribution also should matter in some way. That you need brains for very unusual situations which may occur and whether you can get past them.
Yes. So in this case, the distribution of tasks, the 2 tasks themselves are just identical, right? So they're each equally hard. They're each equally rewarding if you can solve them. And the distribution of those tasks is basically a Bernoulli, right? It's like every day you draw a ball from the urn and it's either A or B. We did explore a bunch of other ways you can consider these tasks. For instance, does the probability change over time or across generations, that sort of thing? And it doesn't really seem to matter, but we have not considered a case where one task, is potentially, super difficult, but maybe super important. But a model, I'll show you in a few more slides, does touch on that. So maybe we can circle back around.
Because there are some evolutionary models where what really matters is these rare events, but whether you survive them, and those are very
yes. Important. Yeah, so we will come back to that in a little bit. Okay, So yeah, one deviation from the kind of expectations of life history theory is that total investment in cognition drops actually after this peak at medium lifespans. And the second thing is that there's also investment in cognition, not always, but most of the time, peaks at intermediate values of environmental complexity. And then as the environment becomes more complex, it actually starts dropping down. So why does cognition reverse? The first I would argue is that living longer gives you more opportunities to learn, so you can learn less efficiently as you go. And the second result, I think, is that complex environments give you the opportunity to regularly interact with both tasks. So there's less need to generalize from one to the other. So in particular, I think that's what's going on with this really steep drop in generalization here. Now you used to have to basically use generalization to learn about these rare tasks. Now you don't. So generalization is expensive. So instead, you massively disinvest in generalization and just up your overall ability to learn directly instead. Okay, so the broad pattern then that was in that model was that for short lifespans or very simple environments, you basically have no cognition at all. Then as the conditions change, you get this spike in cognition that then afterwards kind of eases off to some more intermediate value. And two other projects that I'm involved in to various degrees are turning up a somewhat similar result. So I just wanted to flag those as well. So this is a project led by Evan Russack, a PhD student at Princeton. And he's been looking at the interaction between cognitive control and working memory. So memory is finite, is kind of the premise of this. And so does cognitive control of memory increase fitness, right? So you have a certain amount of memory. Should you just invest in having greater memory capacity? Or maybe you should invest in this ability to kind of metacognitively control your working memory, which is that, actively decide what you're going to try to remember and just choose to forget some other things to free up space. So the color bars here are basically how well agents are doing at this task. The x-axis is their working memory capacity, and the y-axis is their cognitive control of this. And if we start on the left, when your capacity is really low, control doesn't matter at all. Your working memory is so small, you basically can't remember anything. All that matters is how much of it you have, and that affects your performance. But as we increase it further, we then get this now the appearance of a benefit to control, right? You've got enough memory that if you're clever about it and you control it appropriately, you can do very well. And then as your capacity increases further still, this actually tails off. So even with no control, you're doing quite well now. There's a benefit to some control, but you really don't need very much before you hit ceiling performance. And so if we slice through this and look at the increase in recall per unit of control, or if we assume control comes with some sort of fitness cost to maintain, then this becomes basically the fitness landscape, or what's the optimal amount of control for a given capacity. We get a similar thing, where when you have no capacity, you should have no control because it's just not worth it. When you have moderate capacity, you get a large amount of control because you need to make the most of it. And as your capacity goes up even further, actually now the pressure's off. You don't need much control at all to still basically have peak performance. Okay, another example then where we're converging on a similar thing is to do with complexity and detectors. So this is work being led by Cameron Turner, a postdoc at Princeton. And his interest really is going all the way back to the Cambrian. When should you bother to sense at all? Should you have sensors to tell you about the environment? So the kind of example that Cameron uses to mentally represent this model is you're a jellyfish, and some jellyfish species have dedicated neural systems that are touch sensitive. If a predator comes up and bumps them, they just start wiggling a bit more to try and get away from them. It costs them a bunch of calories to wiggle like that. It costs them some calories to try and detect them, but is it worth doing this because it slightly reduces your risk of predation? So why use information at all? Especially because information, if you ignore it, then decisions are quick and easy because you're not actually thinking. You just do stuff. Okay, and so the green line here is the equilibrium sensitivity of your sensors. It's how accurate they are. So good up at the top is superior. As it goes down, it's poor. And the x-axis, here it's labeled the probability of predator presence. So this is, you're a jellyfish, is there a shark coming to bite me, something like that. But it turns out, let me describe the curve first. So what you get is when there are no predators, then you ignore information, right? You just turn off your senses. You don't need senses. When predators are everywhere, so you're living in some sort of jellyfish hellscape, again, you don't need sensors because you don't need to check if there's a shark. You just know there are sharks, so you're just constantly swimming, trying to get away from them. And then in the middle, we get the peak of this kind of sensory discriminatory, cognition in the middle when predators are potentially, absent or present. You don't know, so you need to check. And if you think about this, there's the probability of predators being present or absent, then this actually kind of fits with what we might think of as the environmental complexity hypothesis. The complexity of the environment peaks in the middle, so it makes sense that you should have the most accurate sensors at that point. But you get exactly the same graph if instead of the probability of predator presence, it becomes the danger of predators, right? So if predators are, say, reasonably rare, so 0.2, something like that, you'll get the same results if instead of manipulating the probability of their presence, you manipulate how good they are at attacking you, right? So do they just swallow you whole? The cost is really high. So if predators are reasonably common but very ineffective, you can just ignore them. As they get somewhat effective, you have to start paying attention to them. But if the predators are just so dangerous that the cost of failing to sense one when there is a predator there is just astronomical because it's going to swallow you whole. So this is the most dangerous environment where intuitively you might think, all right, we need the best sensors possible because we really don't want to make a mistake. Or actually, it says just turn off your cognition again. Just assume they're always there and act accordingly. And so again, this is, I think, at least from a biological point of view, a slightly unexpected result where cognition is peaking at this kind of intermediate point. Cameron also included in his model this idea of bias. So in addition to evolving senses to give you accurate information, you can just bias your decision-making apparatus along this scale of being fastidious, impartial, or gullible. And I was thinking back to Monday's talk on pareidolia. You do get exactly what people were expecting, right? This region where as the predators get more frequent or more dangerous, you start degrading your senses a bit, and instead you just become quite biased. So this is a region of adaptive pareidolia, right? These creatures, they're looking for predators, but they see them when they're not really there all the time, and that's because their senses are not as good as they might necessarily be, and they have this bias towards seeing predators even when they're not there. But this is the kind of evolutionarily rational thing to do. So if we look across nature, we get these examples, right? So when predation risk is low, you get species like the dodo who, when sailors turned up and started shooting them all, they just kind of stood around and watched, wondering what was going on and didn't try to escape. When predators are more frequent or more dangerous, you get these adaptations to detect them and act accordingly. So the eyes of herbivores, which help them see what's going on. But when predators get really dangerous or really frequent or just whatever it is in the environment that you're trying to detect, if it becomes really important that you detect this, then you stop trying to detect it, right? You do what poisonous frogs do, which is you just prepare for whatever contingency that is permanently. So these frogs don't need to look out for predators. They are just full of poison, so predators don't want to eat them, and then they just advertise it, and then they can relax. It doesn't matter to them whether predators are there or not anymore. So compared to what I set out as this kind of monotonic view of cognition, I think these results encourages towards a slightly different view of cognition in biological organisms, which is that it's not this scale of how good you are at dealing with environmental complexities, but cognition is this kind of bag of tricks from which you use to get fitness out of the environment by navigating the constraints that you face. So let's see, there we go. Constraints might be 5 minutes, perfect. They might be time, how long you live, how much data you can collect to make decisions. It might be brain power, how much working memory you have available to store things in your mind. Or it might be risks, how dangerous predators are, how frequent food is in the environment, that sort of thing. You don't want to miss, if you're a bear, you don't want to miss where the the beehive is because it's full of honey, that sort of thing. And the general conclusion from all these three models is that when resources are poor or constraints are tight, just don't even try, right? It's not worth it to evolve cognition in those cases. When resources are plentiful, you just don't need to worry, right? Because you don't need cognition to solve these problems. You can just, live the good life. But in between those two, there's this sweet spot where you can actually get a lot of resources out of the environment, but only if you're smart enough, by using your cognition to work around the constraints that you face. Okay, so kind of inspired by the talks of the past few days, I just wanted to dwell a little bit on, why don't biological intelligences just scale up, right? We've seen a lot of these learning models can do great things. Why doesn't biology seem to have approached a similar sort of strategy? And I think the reason is ultimately that lots of these ways you could scale up are just inhibitively costly for biological organisms. So long lifespans are inherently costly. The longer you live, the slower you evolve because you slow down your reproductive cycle, and you also expose yourselves to different kinds of risks. So I think it was in Dan's talk, he mentioned that the learning model could approximate adult human performance if it only got 11,000 years of the baby cam data. But if humans or any other organism approach a lifespan on the millennia scale, then you're exposing yourself to all sorts of odd risks. So things like natural disasters become a major source of attrition for you, right? I did some math, and if humans live that long, about 1 in 5 of us would be hit by lightning in our lifespan, right? And it's not something that we need to worry about now. We worry about like heart disease and stuff. But if we live that long, then lightning and earthquakes become really significant obstacles. Cognitive control is costly. Neurons are energetic. They want calories as they run. And when we look at these cross-taxa studies of cognition and brains and stuff, it actually looks like many of the advances as mammals, split off from our reptilian ancestors and then the primates as well. It looks like one of the changes that happens is that neural tissue somehow is tweaked to get a lot cheaper. So it's not that the brains are just getting better at interacting with the world. We found ways to reduce the costs, and that's what facilitated some neural growth. Accurate sensors, again, more neurons, they're costly. And so organisms must balance these costs in a way that learning models currently don't, right? If a learning model needs the whole internet to function, right now we say, okay, that's fine. We'll try and find ways to pipe in more and more data, but that's just not an option available to biological organisms. And so models then that include some of these costs that are typical of biological systems, they may massively degrade their performance, right? But the benefit of that may be that they might tell us something about biological intelligences. Okay. So I just want to thank everyone who's been working with me on these projects. They've all been funded through a grant from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, part of their Diverse Intelligences program, and that's involving Amanda as well. And thank you guys for listening. I'll happily take questions. Sure.
That was a fascinating talk. So 2 questions, I guess. First one is maybe somewhat like obvious question, is that it sounds like the only reason intelligence has evolved was because of constraints in the environment, like very strong constraints. Is that a correct statement you would say?
I think intelligence, whatever it is, has to work around constraints, but it's the general driving factor is that it evolves when it's worth it trying to match your body state to some environmental condition dynamically and flexibly. It evolves when it pays to do that rather than just kind of pick the most likely thing and just stick with it for your whole lifespan.
Yeah, that's right. And this goes back to the U-shaped sort of graphic. Like in the middle is where you need to sort of think.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, in the conclusion, you said that if we start to view models with some of the constraints you're talking about, you might be able to understand biological intelligence better. But
do you not also think that maybe it is those same constraints and the ways that intelligence has evolved because of these constraints is what yields these very resilient and robust intelligences, like you see in biology, that those artificial systems don't have?
Yeah, so I guess biological intelligences, in a sense, have to be quite robust because the environment is less curated for it. So they're living in a world surrounded by other creatures. The climate changes. Population dynamics are chaotic. So a prey species you might depend on suddenly disappears, and you've got to adjust. And so because of that, it's probably very bad for them to like overfit on anything, right? Because the biological world is very complex, and perhaps a way we've kind of taken care of our learning models is by curating the world that they're in. But then we can expose them to chaos as well.
So one is just probing how far your, by the way, fascinating. Probing how far your model can go, so that you can think of animals that are quite different and have long lifespans. And so you can think of some types of whales, maybe some parrots, maybe large turtles and elephants, all around 100 years, give or take. So I'm wondering if your model predicts all four, given, so what are the different settings? So that's one question. And then one more speculative would be, so if you think of different types of artificial intelligence, if you could then use your model to decide which one will they evolve.
Yeah. So just look at this as a visual aid for now. Assume this like x-axis is lifespan or something.
Right.
And so this is the general pattern that short-lived creatures don't have much cognition. It spikes and it tails off. I think the reason that life history works so well for mammals is because mammals live on this slope, basically. And so the big-bodied, big-brained, smart mammals are all up here. They live a long time. The other mammals aren't. I think the sharks are over here, basically. They're on the other side. So like the Greenland shark lives for, they think, like 350 years or something. We really don't know that much about, fish biology, really, compared to mammals. I think the reason it's ended up here is because the sharks actually live in an easier world, in a sense, or a less cognitively demanding world, which will have the effect to push this down and push it that way. So it's easier to get onto the right-hand side. In terms of the artificial intelligences, I'm not sure how well this is going to answer your question, but one big difference, I think, is that all biological intelligences in deep evolutionary history started here. And so the only way for them to get over onto this side is to basically go through this, or to get some very fortuitous circumstances that mean the environment changes around them and they end up over here. With artificial intelligences, it seems that rather than doing this kind of very slow walk through this landscape, we've been able to jump to this side quite abruptly. And that's something that biology, which is kind of committed to gradualism, can't really do very easily. But we've been able to do it with machines. And so the question is, once you're on this side, what is the pressure to go back up here? Because for the biological species, it's competition with other groups or whatever that are pushing them to actually, not live very long. Live have as short a lifespan as you can, right? Because if you can live, or if you can reproduce faster, then you get some sort of evolvability advantage. And I'm not sure that machines face some of those same costs, but if we, for instance, if some government or someone was like, all right, we'll give a company, $50 billion, or maybe that's not even enough, $50 trillion, if they can find a way to, have one of these learning machines that I can put in a small box and put legs on it, and it can walk around and help you in your daily life, and it doesn't need lots of data, it can do stuff. That's the sort of thing that might start pushing machines towards us, right? You need an incentive to get there, because these, the creatures that live here in our models, they're still doing really well. They just are very data hungry to get there.
So for the artificial systems, you made assumption that there is no constraint to size, but there is, because you can identify each one of them with a certain company that is developing it. There's a metabolic cost of developer time to keep it. keep them alive. Unless customers are buying the service, you have no income, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, it's the same. It sounds similar.
No, I think that's a very good point, actually. And I didn't mean to say that there are no costs at all. I think right now, the amount of excitement around these might be encouraging investors to think like, let's not worry too much about the cost. I'll put some money in and we'll get there later. But if, say, electricity suddenly became way more expensive because of, I don't know, catastrophic changes to the global economy, then there'd be a lot of pressure to become as efficient as you can, right? Or if, salaries went way up so you couldn't employ as many.
So I'm still a little bit confused about your dodo versus poisonous frog spectrum here.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like your model would predict that the poisonous frogs should be dumber than the nearest neighbor non-poisonous frogs, and that the poisonous frogs have more predators than the nearest neighbor non-poisonous. Is that actually the case?
So that is roughly what I would expect. The poisonous frogs, by virtue of being poisonous, should invest less effort in actually trying to detect predators because they don't need to worry about them. Right. I don't know enough about frog cognition to say if that's actually true, but yes, that is the broad prediction that you derive from this.
Yeah, because it would be nice, because the other alternative would be there are multiple routes. You could invest in brain, you could invest in poison, independent on the number of predators, right? You could outsmart them, or you can poison them.
Yes, this work, I guess, says that if predators are either incredibly frequent or incredibly dangerous, then it's worth going for the poison because then you never miss a predator, right? You never make the mistake of failing to spot a predator because you're always ready. So it just depends on the costs, right? It's if cognition is better, if mistakes are a bit more forgiving because you're gonna make some mistakes. Being poisonous is better if you must never miss a predator, but kind of assuming predators are there even when they're not is not that bad. Alison.
Yes, a couple of things. One of them is I've been thinking about this in terms of the Ephros conjecture and whether there is some, so one thing you can do is overfit but get lots of data because you're living for a long time. And it seems as if that might actually put you in the stupid part of the distribution. And which would be sort of interesting, like you could be doing really well, and yet you could not be super intelligent. You could actually have declining intelligence as you actually get more data and you rely more on overfitting, which is kind of nice in terms of the general vision that's out there about the effects of these models, that actually scaling up could make them do well but be stupider at the same time, right? Which seems not impossible. But the other thought is about sort of division of labor. So I think one thing that you might predict is that having, let me articulate this. I think like when you think about short versus long-lived, I think development is kind of like a way of being short-lived versus long-lived in one organism, because obviously when you're a kid, you're only hit for a short period of time, right? And now you're entering into this other regime, which is more like the long data-rich regime. And I'm thinking about, among insects where you have scouts and you have queens and you have a lot of different kinds of creatures with different kinds of cognitive capacities. And I wonder if you could model how much diversity even within a species diverse roles within a species is gonna map on.
Yeah. Right? So I think you're right that one way you can think about kind of exploratory childhood, it's a way to kind of get the benefits of living longer, but just compressed into a shorter lifespan, right? It's like you're getting much data much faster than you would otherwise. So you're manipulating the rate at which you collect data during your lifespan to maximize the utility of getting from it. The second thing you mentioned, so there might be some division of labor. I don't really have much to say precisely about that, but one thing that we do find is if we let vertical transmission evolve, it looks like there's a certain division of labor between generalization and vertical transmission. They're both, in a sense, doing the same thing, which is letting you learn about stuff that you're not directly encountering. And so under a lot of conditions, at least in this model, vertical transmission evolves a lot, and it massively displaces generalization. So you still get a spike in generalization, but it becomes like this sliver, this pinnacle, and then it drops off, and instead vertical transmission takes over. So there is some sort of exchangeability in some of these cognitive abilities. So it's like cognitive division of labor.
It's also relevant to the case of why current LLMs are really stupid and getting stupider, right? So they're really relying completely on vertical transmission. That's the mechanism they have, and it might not be a coincidence that they're not as good at generalization. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
So one thing which
I just want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for the discussion because we have topics in the morning, but just why don't you go and then we'll just
I mean, in your setting, the tasks are in some sense from the environment, but I was wondering if a very significant effect might be sort of the game theoretic one. For example, the dynamics between predator and prey. So if I think of, say, perception and locomotion as two examples, I mean, perception becomes better because the other party is trying to evolve camouflage, so I need to have a better vision system to break camouflage. Similarly, the tiger becomes faster, the deer must run faster, and so on. So so there's a dynamic imposed by that aspect, which is sort of seems slightly different from.
Yeah, so there could be this kind of like a cognitive arms race, I guess. And I do think
Different equilibria, right? I mean, it's totally okay to be a deer, it's totally okay to be a tiger, and you'll end up with different cognitive apparatuses in the two cases.
Yeah, I think that's definitely likely. And I think it might explain as well a bit of what's going on with the sharks and why they have a different thing. So there was some great work from about 3 years ago. Can't remember who by, but they were looking at this, basically this cognitive arms race between predators and prey, either on land or in the ocean. And it turns out that on land, everyone's trapped on a plane, and there's terrain, and you can hide behind objects and have occlusion and stuff like that. And it really drives this arms race where the two are trying to understand each other's trajectories, and the prey's trying to hide, the predator's trying to stay undetected. But in the ocean, it's homogeneous, you can't hide, you can just see each other and just swim at each other and try and take a bite. And it doesn't happen at all, at least in that model, right? So I think you're right, these interspecies evolutionary interactions definitely happen. And they happen in different ways in different contexts. And yeah, they're probably very...
The other thing I was thinking was the applications to human societies. That is a bit of a touchy topic, but there are similar things there, right? If you're in a culture where where food is not so readily available, I mean, people have tried to attribute sort of the years of schooling to environments where you have ready availability of food or not. So the phenomena of development, underdevelopment, and so on. Have you don't want to go there? Have you considered implications in the context of humans?
Okay, yes. If we make humans too resource rich, are we going to become stupid, basically, because we don't need to stress about stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this is like a very old theory, which claimed that if you live in where food is readily available, you don't need to be very smart. If your life is very, very difficult, you're not going to be very smart. It's the
Yeah. I guess a more positive spin is if I don't have to worry about food or predation, I can put all my effort into thinking about mines or whatever it is, right? I don't have to sit on the couch and just,
I was going to say, actually, I would draw the alternative conclusion, which is arguably what your data shows or suggests, is that as you reduce the cost of cognition, you're going to see more cognition appear. Because that's what's driving the reduction in cognition here for all of your cases, is the fact that you're applying a cost, and so there's reason to get rid of it when you don't want to use it. But if you have unlimited energy, then why not just invest in more cognition? And it would be the same for AI. If we can bring down the cost of cognition, why not just invest in more cognition? It's only in the constrained resource case that you get this trade-off.
Yeah, you're right. If cognition or compute became free, then efficiency just does not matter in the slightest.
Okay, gotcha.
The floor.
Thomas? The final section today.